Today, we're looking at a major shift in global trade dynamics. India is considering joining the RCEP, the massive China-led trade bloc that covers 15 countries across Asia-Pacific. India originally opted out, fearing it would harm local industries, but now, with a $1 trillion export target on the horizon, joining RCEP might open crucial doors to Asian markets and supply chains. But here's the twist: India's potential RCEP membership has big implications for the US, which sees India as a key partner in balancing China's influence in the Indo-Pacific. If India integrates more with RCEP, it could impact American interests, from tech and agriculture to regional strategy. We'll break down what India stands to gain, how the US might respond, and what strategies both sides could adopt to keep their partnership strong in this fast-changing landscape. India's potential reconsideration of RCEP membership. Background: the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, is a massive trade agreement among 15 Asia-Pacific countries, including China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and all 10 ASEAN countries. It's a bit like a regional supermarket for trade where these countries get the equivalent of a loyalty card. They trade with each other on preferred terms, lower tariffs, smoother processes, and more direct market access, making it easier to buy and sell across borders without the usual hoops. Together, these countries cover around a third of the world's GDP and population, which gives them serious global trade influence. India was involved in RCEP negotiations from the start, back in 2013. However, after years of discussions, India decided to step back and opted not to join in 2019. It was a tough call. Imagine you're joining a club, but every new rule they introduce seems to make life harder for you. India had significant concerns about its domestic economy, particularly in areas like agriculture and small businesses, where local players would likely struggle to compete with a surge of imports from larger economies, especially China. India's trade deficit with China was already high, so allowing even more goods from China at reduced tariffs felt like opening the floodgates in a way that could hurt local industries. The hesitation also came from a broader sense of needing to protect vulnerable sectors. For example, dairy farmers feared competition from New Zealand, where dairy products are cheaper and could flood the market. In a country where agriculture supports millions, this kind of shift could mean livelihoods at risk. The small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, that form the backbone of Indian manufacturing also worried about getting edged out by cheaper goods coming in from countries with highly efficient manufacturing systems. But in recent months, things have been changing. Global trade patterns are in flux due to pandemic recovery, shifting alliances, and supply chain realignments. India is under pressure to expand its export base and reach its ambitious economic targets, like the $1 trillion export target by 2030. There's been increasing talk among Indian policymakers and economic advisors about the need to reconsider RCEP. Organizations like the World Bank have even suggested that India joining RCEP could be a shortcut to these goals, arguing that India might miss out on important supply chain opportunities if it stays on the sidelines. For a country as big as India, joining RCEP would be like getting a fast pass to integrate into some of the world's most active trade networks. The potential for Indian companies to access new markets in the region could be enormous. Recent developments. India's stance on RCEP seems to be evolving, and there are a couple of key drivers behind this shift. First, we have the perspective coming from BVR Subramaniam, the CEO of Niti Aayog, India's government think tank. He's a top official, somewhat like a national strategist, and recently, he's been publicly advocating for India to reconsider joining RCEP. His argument centers on a sector that's vital to India's economy: micro, small, and medium enterprises, MSMEs. These small businesses form the backbone of India's economy, employing millions and contributing significantly to exports. Think of them as the heart and soul of India's local industries, producing everything from textiles to machinery parts. Subramaniam's point is that joining RCEP could give these MSMEs easier access to some of the world's biggest and most dynamic markets. By connecting directly with other RCEP countries, these businesses could integrate into global value chains more efficiently. In simple terms, India would be plugging in to a larger system, allowing its small businesses to work directly with other countries' manufacturers and suppliers. For example, an Indian auto parts manufacturer could supply parts to a South Korean car company, tapping into their extensive car manufacturing network. Such opportunities could lead to more jobs, more exports, and more innovation among local businesses. Then there's the World Bank's perspective. A few months ago, they suggested India reconsider RCEP membership as a strategy to hit its $1 trillion export target by 2030. This isn't just a casual goal, it's part of India's long-term plan to position itself as a major player in the global economy. However, achieving this without being part of major trade agreements like RCEP is like trying to play a high-stakes game without the right equipment. While other RCEP countries are building supply chain networks and trading smoothly among themselves, India might risk being left on the sidelines, missing out on the action. A good example of this effect can be seen in the electronics sector. Many Southeast Asian countries are becoming critical hubs for electronics manufacturing, partially because they have these easy trade channels through RCEP. Companies there can move components and finished products quickly and cheaply across borders. Without being part of this setup, Indian companies may find themselves at a disadvantage when trying to compete in the same space. For India, getting involved in RCEP could be like joining a well-oiled machine, allowing its businesses to benefit from the supply chain synergies that member countries enjoy. Implications for the United States. If India decides to join RCEP, the ripple effects are likely to reach the United States. The US has been steadily building a partnership with India, especially in the Indo-Pacific, where China's influence has been a major concern. In many ways, the US sees India as a regional counterbalance to China, a kind of anchor in the area to keep trade and security more stable and less centered around Chinese dominance. But if India joins RCEP, it's essentially entering a China-led trade group, which could shift some of the dynamics Washington has been carefully shaping. On the economic front, RCEP is built to reduce tariffs and open up markets among its member nations. This is good news for RCEP members, but for the US, it could mean increased competition in India. Take American agricultural exports, for instance. India is a big market, and the US exports a range of agricultural products there. However, if India joins RCEP, other members, like Australia and New Zealand, would have reduced tariffs and easier access to Indian markets. For US farmers, that could mean losing ground, as Australian or New Zealand goods become cheaper for Indian buyers. There's also the technology sector to consider. US tech companies, from software giants to hardware manufacturers, have long been invested in India, both in terms of sales and production partnerships. But with India part of RCEP, the pull to engage in regional supply chains might mean more partnerships within Asia, particularly with countries like South Korea and Japan. This could affect how US companies approach their India operations or even shift some investments away if the RCEP network becomes a more efficient option for sourcing and distribution. Beyond just trade, there's the supply chain impact. If India joins RCEP, it's likely to become more interconnected with China-dominated supply chains across Asia. In recent years, the US has made moves to reduce its dependency on Chinese supply chains, especially in strategic industries like semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. However, if India integrates deeply into the RCEP supply chain network, US companies could face tough choices. Take a US-based electronics manufacturer that relies on both Indian and Southeast Asian suppliers. With India in RCEP, the interconnected supply chains might make it more challenging for US companies to rely on non-China networks, as they would now be operating within a web where China holds substantial influence. In short, while India's RCEP membership could open doors for its economy, it poses a challenge for the US, which may need to adjust its strategies in the Indo-Pacific. The US would have to find ways to keep India close in terms of both trade and security, even as India gains a new set of trading partners and economic ties within RCEP. It's like having a close friend join a different club. You'll need to figure out how to keep the friendship strong, even if they're forming new alliances elsewhere. Strategic recommendations. Given the shifting dynamics, the US might want to take a proactive approach in its relationship with India, especially if India does decide to join RCEP. Here are a few practical steps that could help keep the US-India partnership strong and mutually beneficial. 1. Engage with India on trade alternatives. Right now, the US has an opportunity to talk with India about trade frameworks that can offer similar benefits to RCEP but with a stronger alignment to US interests. For example, expanding the existing bilateral trade agreements or even forming a US-India trade partnership could offer India benefits without tying it too closely to a China-led group. This approach would be similar to the US supporting initiatives like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, where the focus is on enhancing trade ties with a group of like-minded countries. By offering India something tangible, the US can encourage it to stay connected with Western trade policies, even if it does join RCEP. 2. Build sector-specific partnerships. Another way to maintain strong ties is to double down on sector-specific collaborations. Technology, pharmaceuticals, and defense are some areas where the US and India already have shared interests. If India is connecting more deeply with RCEP members for general trade, the US can work with India to strengthen collaborations in these critical sectors where both countries have strategic priorities. For instance, the US could continue to develop partnerships with India in semiconductor production, a sector both countries want to grow independently of China. By focusing on these high-impact areas, the US keeps a strong foothold in India's economic landscape. 3. Monitor and adapt to changing trade policies. It will also be important for the US to keep a close eye on how India's participation in RCEP could impact US economic interests directly. If US companies are starting to face stiffer competition in the Indian market because of reduced tariffs for RCEP members, the US might want to explore policy tools to support those industries. For example, if American agriculture faces increased competition from Australia and New Zealand, the US could consider incentives or subsidies for these industries to stay competitive globally. 4th, strengthen other regional alliances. If India's joining RCEP shifts the regional dynamics, the US might need to reinforce its relationships with other Indo-Pacific countries. For example, strengthening economic ties with Japan, South Korea, and Australia could create a counterbalance within the region, ensuring the US maintains influence even if India grows closer to RCEP members. This would be a bit like diversifying investments. By deepening ties across several countries, the US reduces the impact of any one partnership shifting direction. By taking these steps, the US can continue to maintain a strong presence in the Indo-Pacific region while adapting to India's evolving role within RCEP. The key is to stay flexible, offering India compelling alternatives and support while also safeguarding US interests. With these strategies, the US can navigate the new landscape and ensure that its relationship with India remains strong, even as India explores new alliances. In summary, India's reconsideration of joining the RCEP represents a significant shift in its trade strategy, and it's bound to have ripple effects across the Indo-Pacific and beyond. This decision isn't happening in a vacuum, it's part of a larger story about how global trade and alliances are reshaping themselves. For the US, this development highlights the challenge of staying engaged with India while recognizing that India has its own set of interests and goals. For India, joining RCEP could open doors to new markets, greater supply chain integration, and perhaps even a faster path to achieving its ambitious economic goals, like the $1 trillion export target by 2030. By linking up with some of the largest economies in Asia, India could increase its influence in regional trade, reduce its reliance on Western markets, and access a larger customer base right at its doorstep. For example, Indian businesses in sectors like textiles, auto parts, and electronics could start tapping into demand from Southeast Asia or Japan, strengthening India's role in these industries. However, the US has its own set of interests to consider. America's relationship with India has grown significantly over the past few years, especially as both countries work to counterbalance China's influence in the region. India joining a China-led trade group could make this relationship more complex. Yet, with thoughtful strategies, like creating trade alternatives, reinforcing sector-specific partnerships, and staying agile in regional diplomacy, the US has ways to navigate this shift without losing the benefits of its partnership with India. In essence, India's RCEP membership would be like adding a new player to an already intricate game of chess in the Indo-Pacific. Each move will have consequences, not just for India and the US, but for the entire region. Both countries need to think several steps ahead to ensure they keep a strong connection, even as India explores new avenues in its trade journey.